Okay, now for tonight, we are really so thrilled to have Peter Finn in to talk about his new book, Guest of the Reich. In addition to being an author, Peter has an incredible career. He is now the current national security editor for the Washington Post. But his career spans many years, including back in 1998, Finn spent 10 years overseas for the paper as the bureau chief in its Warsaw, Berlin, and Moscow bureaus. He reported on the 1999 war in Kosovo and its aftermath. Then, following the September 11, 2001 attacks, Peter Finn covered terrorism for the Post, traveling extensively in the Middle East, North Africa, and the Persian Gulf. He was also embedded with the U.S. Special Forces during the invasion of Iraq, and in all, Finn has reported from more than 60 countries for the Washington Post and was twice a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for international reporting. In 2013, Finn was appointed national security editor and was part of a team of editors on the Pulitzer Prize-winning stories based on the documents leaked by Edward Snowden. He oversaw the reporting on the Russian interference in the presidential election and its fallout that won the 2018 Pulitzer Prize for national reporting. Finn is also the co-author of The Zhivago Affair, The Kremlin, the CIA, and the Battle Over a Forbidden Book. Tonight, he will talk about A Guest of the Reich, and please help me give a warm Kansas City welcome to Peter Finn.
Thank you, Carrie. I'm thrilled to be here, and thank you all for coming out. My first time in Kansas City, and I've really enjoyed myself in my short time here. As some of you may know, my book is about Gertrude Legendre, the first American woman in uniform captured by the Nazis, and her very strange period of captivity, which I'll describe. At the time of her capture, her husband Sidney was a Navy lieutenant commander stationed in Hawaii, and when he was pulled out of work to be told the shocking news that his wife was now a prisoner of war in Nazi Germany, his first two words were, "Poor Germans." And that tells you something essential about Gertrude, or Gertie as everyone called her. She was this fierce, fearless, adventurous woman. She had a life philosophy which was, I don't contemplate life, I live it. But at the same time, she could also be, deeply unsympathetic. She could be self-absorbed. She could be reckless. And I guess that combination of being both fascinating and flawed is what drew me to her, because she was a very complicated character study. And one of the things I've learned over the last 2 months as people react to the book is how strongly they react to her, which I take as a success, because sometimes I go to Goodreads and I see my one-star review with someone saying, "I hate this woman," and they have little else to say about her. But you may love her, you may hate Gertie, but she's a woman who's impossible not to be absorbed by in some respects. I came across Gertie quite by accident. I had written, as Carrie noted, a book, The Zhivago Affair, that came out in 2014. And that was about another very difficult personality, Boris Pasternak, and his novel, Dr. Zhivago, which became a point of struggle between East and West, between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It was, in fact, one of the key moments in the cultural Cold War. And the book, in part, was based on CIA documents that I persuaded them to release, but it took an awful long time, maybe 4 years, because the CIA, to try and convince them to release previously classified documents, is a very slow, arduous process. And I was looking around for something new to do, and I thought it would be interesting to do something on the OSS. And Gertie was a civilian employee of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was the wartime U.S. espionage service, in many respects the forerunner of the CIA. The great thing about the OSS is that all its papers have been declassified. They are all at the National Archives and free to study. So I started reading books about the OSS and came across these brief references to this society heiress who was captured on the Western Front in September 1944, and I was curious, so I started to research her and learned that there were tons of files on her at the National Archives. In addition, she had written her own memoir in 1947 that got very little attention. And beyond that, all of her personal papers, and Gertie was someone who wrote journals, she wrote letters, she took photographs, she did recordings. They were all preserved at the College of Charleston in South Carolina. So in combination, I had this really interesting woman, this interesting story, and a rich trove of material to work with, which is what I think every author wants. They want a little-known story and a lot of original material to work with. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about Gertie and her background. She was born in Aiken, South Carolina in 1902. She was born into a fabulously wealthy American family. Her parents, her father and grandfather ran a carpet and flooring business out of Amsterdam, New York, that eventually became a nationwide enterprise. And when her grandfather died, her father inherited in today's dollars what amounted to $1 billion. And by the time Gertie left high school, the family had moved. They used to summer between Amsterdam, New York, and Aiken, South Carolina, but they had bought a fabulous townhouse on 72nd Street in Manhattan, right off Central Park. And Gertie, as a young woman, was escorted around Manhattan in a chauffeured Rolls Royce. Every morning, the butler laid out theater and other tickets for anyone in the family who wanted to go out that evening. She did a lot of fancy dress costumes. She had an enormously privileged life, but for her, she wanted something more. She'd always been something of a tomboy. She'd learned to shoot a gun at a very early age. She went birding. And when she graduated high school, instead of coming out, she wanted to go hunting in Wyoming. So that summer, she went to Jackson, which at that time was just a dusty little town with a post office. And she went up into the Tetons with a guide and killed her first elk. And one of the things about Gertie, as people respond to her today, is they have this visceral negative reaction to the fact that she was a hunter. But for hunting for Gertie was a great escape, and she did it a lot of her life. She became addicted to it after that first trip and hunted across North America through the 1920s in Canada, in parts of the West. And in 1927, she went on her first hunting expedition to Africa, East Africa. And at that time, a lot of, hunting was a big thing for a lot of wealthy Americans. And when they arrived in East Africa, to Nairobi generally, which was set up to cater for all of these wealthy Americans and also wealthy Brits, they would hire dozens and dozens of local people. They would import portable toilets from Manhattan. They would import all their weapons, their bullets. They would spend weeks on end hunting on, literally shooting everything that moved. And on that first trip, they literally shot everything that moved. But the whole experience for Gertie seemed a little empty. She came away from it thinking that the killing was wanton, there was no purpose to it. It was too luxurious in contrast to her hunting experiences in North America, where she lived in the wilderness. She was a tough, tough woman. So she decided from that point forward she wanted her hunting to have a purpose. And the following year, she went on an expedition for the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and this was the beginning of a series of expeditions she did for American museums. And in that instance, it was to bring back specimens of the nyala, which is a kind of antelope. And if you go to the American Museum of Natural History in New York today, and you go to the Hall of African Mammals, there's a series of dioramas with different specimens in their locale, perfectly stuffed. And one of those has her name at the bottom because those nyala were brought back by Gertie. And the whole expedition cost tens of thousands of dollars, which her father gave her to do. And she continued to do that through the 1930s. That second exhibition also had a dual purpose. The summer before she went, she was in Oxford, England, and she kind of became smitten with these two young men from New Orleans, Sidney Legendre and Maurice Legendre, and she couldn't make up her mind which of them she preferred. So she invited both of them on the expedition, figuring that it might help her work out which of them would make the better husband. Turned out it was Sidney, and they ended up getting married in 1929, right before the crash. They went honeymooning in British Columbia in the middle of a snowstorm, and when they came back, the country was in the beginnings of, real economic trauma. But Gertie's family, fortunately for her, kept a lot of their money in cash and not in stocks, and they were less affected by it. She and her husband then went to South Carolina, where they bought an old plantation outside Charleston, eventually built it up into 7,000 acres, which is still there today, but not in the family. But she continued, as I said, through the 1930s to hunt in Iran, in Vietnam, in Southwest Africa, in other places, and she would go back and forth between these expeditions that could last up to 9 months and their plantation in South Carolina. And she never worked a day in her life. I mean, this was her life. But war broke out. Pearl Harbor, they were in Medway listening to the radio when they heard about the attack. Sidney got a commission in the Naval Reserve and initially was transferred to Washington, where he did intelligence training before he knew he would be transferred to the intelligence center on Hawaii. Because he was a slightly older man, he would have been in his late 30s then, he was not going to go into combat. Gertie initially wanted to work as well. She tried the Library of Congress, but they rejected her because she didn't have a college degree. She tried the American Red Cross for a full-time position, but they rejected her because she had 2 young children. She eventually used her connections to get into the newly created Office of Strategic Services, and she got a position there in their communications office. Sidney left in August 1942 for Hawaii, and that was the beginning of Gertie and Sidney writing over 500 letters to each other over the course of the war, which provided me with just an enormous wealth of material about what they were seeing and doing and feeling. Gertie's letters were franker about her own feelings. Sidney's tended to, talk about what he did that day, and he went surfing after work, and then he had a great dinner because his letters were subject to censorship, so he couldn't talk about his work. But Gertie wrote that first letter to him, and I'd like to give you just a tiny sense of the letter. The letters, on the day he left, Gertie returned to her home and Sidney, on arriving in San Francisco, immediately wrote to Gertie saying, "We talked about the war and other things when we both knew that all we really wanted to say was how much we loved one another and how we dreaded the parting. I thought you were wonderful to be able to wave to me as I entered the plane and to wish me good luck. My throat was so choked and my eyes so full of tears that I could not say anything and only waved and then plunged into the plane. So over the course of the war, they continued to write these very confessional letters to each other, which provided me with just a fantastic amount of raw material. Gertie, as I said, she got this job in the communications office, which meant that she was handling all communications in and out of OSS, the Secret Intelligence Branch of OSS. So she was getting a fairly, maybe glancing, but a lot of insight into what OSS was doing, its organization, its plans, and what the branches overseas were sending back. But Gertie grew to hate Washington, I think for two reasons. She thought it was this gray, bureaucratic city that was very far from the action. And I think she associated the city with her separation from her husband. So she came to hate the place because she wasn't with Sydney. And she made strenuous efforts to get to Hawaii, but the Navy had a strict rule that wives could not join their husbands in the theater of operations, even far behind the lines like Hawaii. They just wouldn't allow it. And so to Gertie's great frustration, she was forced to stay put. So she then began to agitate to get out of Washington to anywhere, really. She said she was open to Egypt, she was open to an Asian posting, but while Bill Donovan suggested she go to London. And this is the second part of Gertie's personality that people have some difficulty with. At this point, Gertie had two daughters. One was 11, the other was 2. Or one was 9 at that point, the other was 2. Her husband was in Hawaii. There was no prospect of him coming home. And yet she was willing to leave them, which she did. She told Sydney that she was just too restless. You know, she couldn't see herself as just mothering and working in Washington. She wanted to get to where the action was. And so in the summer of 1943, having left her children with their longtime governess, the older daughter was in a boarding school near Washington, the younger was in the care of this governess, she took a ship from Philadelphia to Lisbon, stopping in the Azores. At that point in the war, the U.S. had fairly established control over the Atlantic, and the U-boat threat had subsided. From Lisbon, she took a flying boat plane to Southampton. As they were coming in, they lost an engine. They had to make an emergency landing, which was fairly typical arrival anywhere for Gertie, a lot of drama. And then she went to London, where she took up the same position, essentially, running all communications out of the London branch of OSS, which was the largest overseas branch of OSS, and obviously a key place in advance of D-Day, a key place for relations with the governments in exile. So again, she was seeing a lot of top secret material by virtue of her position, even though she was a civilian employee, not a spy per se. D-Day eventually came, and London appeared deserted to her, and Gertie was again quickly bored and agitating to get to France. And in September 1944, she was transferred to what would become the newly created OSS branch in Paris, to do exactly the same thing, run the communications office, manage all the traffic in and out. But the branch wasn't ready. They were still constructing it. She got a 5-day leave of absence. And on the first day, she went to the bar at the Hotel Ritz where there were a bunch of journalists talking about going to the front lines, and she met another OSS guy, Bob Jennings, and they decided, well, why don't we just go up to Luxembourg and see what we can, see if we can get close to the fighting. And it was important for Gertie to be able to do that because she thought she was going to return to the United States within a couple of months. Her husband was about to get a leave of absence, and she didn't want to return to the United States without, as she put it, smelling the fighting. So they drove from Paris to Luxembourg. There were a series of misadventures on the way. The car broke down. But eventually they ended up in Luxembourg, but it took them so long to get there, they really thought that the trip was a bust. And they were having breakfast in the hotel in Luxembourg City when in walked two other OSS guys, one of whom knew Jennings. They told them about why they wanted to, why they had come to Luxembourg. And one of the two people who came in, Major Gerry Papert, who was in counterintelligence, said he was going to visit this small German village called Wallendorf, which was the first place in Nazi Germany captured by the Allies. And in fact, that was all true. The Allies had crossed in, taken the village after some small fighting, and in fact pushed beyond it several miles into Germany. But then orders came to pull back because the US Army at that point had moved across France so quickly that supply lines were becoming stretched. They wanted to consolidate till the supply lines were back running as efficiently as possible. So they withdrew from this little portion of Germany, withdrew from Wallendorf, and without Papert's knowledge, even though he checked a situation map, the village was back in German hands. So they drove blithely into this place and were immediately opened fire on. There were four of them, Papert, Jennings, Gertie, and a young kid called Doyle Dixon, a private, who was the driver. Dixon and Papert were wounded, both pretty badly, and they surrendered. And Gertie was now a prisoner of war, and I say that she was the first woman in uniform captured because prior to moving from London to Paris, she was commissioned in the Women's Army Corps because to enter the theater of operations, you had to be in uniform, even if you were a civilian in one of the American agencies. They were bounced around inside Germany through several places, moved further in as prisoners until they eventually landed at this castle called Dietz Castle, which was a special Wehrmacht interrogation center for prisoners of particular interest. And the Germans initially thought they were spies. I mean, what is this woman doing here? What is Jennings, a naval officer, doing here? Why are they driving in Wallendorf? And they were all subjected to parallel interrogations to see if they could break them. The implications of that would have been quite severe, to have the Germans believe they were spies, and other OSS people during the war were summarily executed by the Germans. So, to their credit, all of them withstood the interrogation. They had created a kind of quick cover story for each other, and Gertie had got some training back in Washington on a cover story before she went to Europe, which was that she was a file clerk in the embassy, a woman of no importance, and that is what she stuck to. And the others, Jennings and Papert as well. Dixon, I think the Germans quickly realized, was of no great value, and he was shipped from a transit camp to a camp in the east. But the other three were held. They did not break, but unfortunately for Gertie, normally a woman, I mean, she was the first woman, but there were subsequently some nurses captured. They would have been quickly transferred back And over the course of the war, there were exchanges of non-combatants between Nazi Germany and the Allies through the intercession of the Swiss. But unfortunately for Gertie, Jennings and then Gertie herself discussed her background, that she was from this very prominent American family, that she knew General Patton socially, that she knew the US ambassador to London socially, that she knew the Secretary of the Navy socially, that she knew the Secretary of the War socially. And quickly the Germans realized they had a highly valuable one, either propaganda tool or potential prisoner that they could use in an exchange or for other purposes down the line. And within the Nazi regime, there began to be a little bit of a struggle between the Wehrmacht, the army, the Foreign Office, and the SS over who would control Gertie. And it's no big surprise that the SS were the ones who got her on the specific orders of Hitler, according to post-war documents, who settled the matter. So Gertie was moved from this special interrogation center, Dietz, to Berlin. And if I could, I'd like to read you just a short excerpt from the book about her trip from from Frankfurt to Berlin. She was taken from Dietz to go by train to Berlin. To Gertie, Frankfurt appeared mortally wounded, a shocking contrast to the vibrant city with its medieval center that she had visited in 1936. Her escorts drove her to what appeared to be the only intact building for several blocks, and Gertie was immediately alarmed when she saw guards from the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, the intelligence service of the SS and the Nazi Party. The offices had no electricity, and Gertie was brought to a third-story room lit by an oil lamp where she was given a glass of Malaga wine and some potato salad. Gertie's stay was brief, and towards 11 p.m., her escorts took her to the Frankfurt train station. Its arched halls of iron and glass reduced to ribboned shells. The station was teeming with soldiers, and many seemed sick or lame as they hauled their equipment onto trains. Gertie buttoned her unmarked raincoat to her chin to cover her American uniform. Her caution was warranted. Other POWs had encountered angry mobs while being transported, and as the bombing of Germany's cities intensified, there were reports of civilians assaulting and in some cases killing prisoners. The trip to Berlin was fitful. A train in front of Gertie's was bombed, forcing those behind to reroute. Hours were spent waiting on the line. On either side of the tracks, destroyed railway cars littered the ground like broken toys. From the Lichterfelde neighborhood into the center, Berlin's classic 5-story apartment building stood off the tracks like an honor guard of ruin, the roofs and floors having collapsed to the foundations, the windows agape. There is block after block where man-made fire has swept the life from every building, leaving nothing but the raw, scorched walls, one witness wrote. Gertie arrived in central Berlin at 3 p.m. Clutching her Red Cross box and shoulder bag, she was pushed out of the station by her guards through dense crowds of soldiers and civilian passengers, people scrambling madly for seats on the chronically overcrowded trains. Away from the bustle of the station, the center of the capital of what was once imagined to be the 1,000-year Reich was a dead city. The buildings were broken, the streets were all but empty. Rubble blocked sidewalks and spilled into the streets. Few buses or streetcars ran, and there were almost no private cars. The gaunt pedestrians, Gertie thought, wore masks of defeat and apathy. Gertie walked through the streets with her guards to 8 Prince Albrechtstrasse, Gestapo Headquarters. The high stone entryway was as forbidding as ever. Swastika flags and busts of Hitler decorated the central passageway of the building, the former School of Industrial Arts and Crafts. But the large windows were covered with cardboard, and inside it was dark and frigid, drafts gusting around Gertie's ankles. Parts of the staff and their files had been evacuated that August as the bombing of the center of Berlin intensified. The imposing marble lobby no longer reeked of fear and malevolence, but was redolent of the coming defeat, even though the remaining party officials continued to, quote, strut around with the old pomposity. So Gertie, from there, was taken to a villa on the edge of Berlin in the Wannsee neighborhood, famous as the neighborhood where the Wannsee Conference was held to map out the final solution. She was in a nearby villa that was part of the Reich security main office, or owned by them. And she spent 2 months there. She had crossed from being a prisoner of war into what was called by the Nazis a special and honored prisoner of the SS. And bizarrely, the Nazis had a parallel detention center that began before the war, where they held prisoners of special value, prisoners that they could exploit in the future, prisoners who might have some propaganda value, in this separate detention center. They were all adjuncts to the main death camps, but they were either special buildings within those camps, hotels, villas, and in some instances, castles. So Gertie in Berlin was in this villa on her own with a German staff, and she stayed there for 2 months, was subject to a series of further interrogations by the SS. I think she continued to frustrate them with her independent spirit, her refusal to be broken, her insistence, even through the Battle of the Bulge, that Patton was on his way, and it was only a matter of time before the Americans would be in Berlin. She even at one point was, and she never knew if this was true or not, offered the possibility of meeting Hitler, which she flatly refused, much to the chagrin of her captors, who thought this would have been, of course, a great honor. After 2 months in Berlin, Gertie was moved again. I think the staff there wanted her out of the place. And she was shifted initially to a hotel on the Rhine, used to be Hitler's favorite hotel before the war. But as she crossed Germany again to Cologne, and then from Cologne, she drove through Bonn, the city of Bonn, which had just been firebombed. She saw buildings collapsing in flame as they passed through, and then in the middle of the night, around 2 a.m., she landed at this hotel surrounded by SS guards, barbed wire, walked in, and the reception area, there were 2 more SS guards, essentially acting as the hotel receptionists. She was brought up to a very comfortable room, nice bed, and told to appear for breakfast at 9 a.m. The following morning, she came down, passing guards on each floor, was attracted by the buzz of conversation that she could hear on the ground floor, and walked into a room of more than 70 elderly French men and 1 French woman who was General de Gaulle's sister. This was her new place of captivity, another part of the parallel detention center that the Germans ran. And she stayed there for another couple of months. The place was run essentially like an old people's home. They argued with each other about the quality of the food, about whether the place was too hot or too cold. They played checkers. They had little lecture series. It was a strange, strange place. But eventually they could hear the American guns in the distance. They were forced to retreat. Gertie was moved again, this time to an estate of a German industrialist outside Frankfurt. While there, she was even given a gun to help shoot a couple of hawks that were killing the industrialist's chickens, again, another bizarre thing that a prisoner of war would be given a gun by one of her captors. But the reason she was taken there, I believe, is they had decided to send her back. They wanted to indoctrinate her with anti-Soviet propaganda. There was a persistent fantasy on the part of some top Nazis, all the way up to Himmler, that the Allies could be split, that they could split the Soviets from the British and Americans and Canadians if only they could make them realize the dangers of the Bolshevik hordes, as they call them, and the likelihood that they would sweep across Western Europe. And various efforts were made to foster this division. It was never going to happen. Roosevelt had made unconditional surrender the bottom line. Hitler himself had no interest in any kind of compromise or deal because he felt if Germany was to be defeated, then Germany should be destroyed. It wasn't worth making any deals for its survival. But while in this estate, Gertie was subjected to, kind of casual propagandizing by this industrialist in advance of her return to Germany, or to the Allies. And this was arranged, again, to get her across into Switzerland. I'm going to save a little bit. Her escape was quite dramatic. Nothing Gertie did was without drama, but I'm hoping that perhaps you, if you haven't read the book, you will read it and you'll discover how she got out. It was through the German city of Constance, which was on Lake Constance, and the Swiss and German borders met in the city, and it was one of the few preserved German cities during the war because the lights of Constance blended with the lights of the Swiss city, so it was never bombed. And this was the place where all through the war transfers took place, so Gertie was taken there to go across, but as I said, it wasn't without incident. I appreciate your time, and I guess we're now, I see the mics have arrived. Hopefully you have some questions.
So yes, we've got 2 microphones down front, and if I might ask you, Peter, how did living in Berlin and this part of the world influence how you approached the book and thought about the book? And I just think about covering national security, and if you'd ever had the opportunity to interview Gertie, what that might be like. It seems like she might not be as quiet about her secrets as others in this industry.
Well, I obviously would have loved to have met Gertie. Unfortunately, Gertie lived to the ripe old age of 97. She was just a couple of days shy of 98 when she died in 2000 at her plantation outside Charleston. People often ask me, would you have liked Gertie? Would the two of you have gotten along? That's probably not, I think, Gertie was very class conscious. She had her society friends. She would indulge others, but, I obviously don't move in those kinds of circles. But that's not to say I found her just endlessly fascinating. It was a real privilege to write her story. I understand why some people don't like every aspect of her character. Some of it's distasteful, like a lot of, she had absorbed views that were not unprevalent at the time, including anti-Semitism. Obviously, it wasn't comparable to Nazi anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism in the US at that time was a very real thing. If you take, for instance, Northwest Washington, near where I live, there were compacts that obviously black people were not allowed to live in those neighborhoods, but there were also compacts preventing Jews from living in those neighborhoods in Washington, D.C., like Georgetown, Cleveland Park, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a very different world that she lived in. As to my experience in Germany, I mean, I knew every place that she had been. I'd been there myself. It helped me approach the German archives to get what material I could from them. I had German friends who assisted me with translations because you want your translations to be perfect. So that's what I would say, sir.
Yes. What was Gertie's political views? Was she pro-Roosevelt?
No, hated Roosevelt.
Hated Roosevelt.
Yeah.
Right-wing nut, basically.
Did not like Roosevelt. Thought of him as, you know, she was conservative. She would have been
right of center, shall we say?
She would have been right of center. You know, she didn't believe in high taxation. She didn't believe in some of the reforms Roosevelt had introduced. She was obviously heavily taxed herself as a very wealthy woman. A lot of the correspondence is about money and trusts and, you know, how to preserve what they have. But yes, Gertie would have been right of center. Interestingly, her daughter, at least the one who wrote her own self-published memoir, you know, was actually quite liberal. So I guess probably a natural reaction.
Did not like the New Deal at all, I would think.
She did not like the New Deal, no.
Oh, thank you.
Sir?
Well, I have several questions.
Yeah.
Did the United States have a similar guest program that they held?
Not that I'm aware of at that level, no.
Okay. And what was
obviously if they had captured you know, a senior German official, he would have been held for special questioning. That was inevitable. But a kind of whole system of hotels and villas and dedicated buildings inside the death camps where they held some of these people, and castles. I mean, the two French prime ministers and a whole host of other senior French officials were held at a castle in Austria where Charles de Gaulle's sister ultimately ended up. No, there was no system like that.
What was her life after the war? Did she ever settle down, or did she continue to be kind of a vagabond?
Well, she never left Medway. You know, she lived there for the rest of her life, though she continued to travel extensively, and she continued to go on scientific expeditions much more than hunting as her life progressed. She became an ardent conservationist. You know, everything that she saw in Africa, you know, she realized how the game, the animals were being destroyed, and so you know, her point of view on that all changed. Now, tragically for Gertie, a couple of years after the war, Sidney died of a heart attack. Very young man, totally out of the blue. Gertie had one more very unfortunate unsuccessful marriage that lasted 5 years, but otherwise, you know, she became one of the matriarchs of Charleston, South Carolina. She was a big society woman. She had an annual fancy dress ball that, you know, the cream of Charleston society attended. She once rode into one of her fancy dress parties on an elephant. I mean, Gertie was nothing but out there. Pretty spectacular woman. Yes, sir.
Slightly off topic, but I was Afghanistan Papers. I was wondering if you'd comment on that.
Well, my colleagues on the investigative staff spent 3 years attempting to get these papers after they realized that these interviews had taken place. We realized that they were probably very candid, given that it was one government official talking to another, rather than them talking to the public or talking to the press. I think they've given us great insight into policy making, and I think it's a stellar example of public service journalism. It tells us what our government was saying, doing within the confines of its own spaces, and what it was saying and doing and telling us, which were two different things.
Thank you.
Back to the book. Was she an only child? Did she have any other family?
She did have, interestingly, she had two siblings, one a sister and a brother. Her brother, Laddie, as he was called, was an international polo player, married a Hollywood movie star, had his own, fairly prominent life. And her sister, Gertie was the youngest, by the way. Her older sister married an Italian diplomat in the 1930s who was also a polo player, which is how they met. This diplomat became one of Mussolini's closest aides. They said that he taught Mussolini how to use a knife and fork and how to comport himself in high Italian society. This actually was an issue for Gertie when she applied for the OSS, because as happens today, happened then, everyone who joins an organization like that is subject to a security background check, and Gertie was subject to a security background check, and it turned up the fact that her brother-in-law was an Italian diplomat in Rome, close to Mussolini. They decided, however, that, Gertie was, as they put it in the parlance of the documents at the time, a true American patriot, and so that she could be trusted, and her sister's presence in Rome was probably an accident of history rather than that she was any kind of dedicated fascist. Her sister survived the war, and unfortunately there was a lot of tragedy and death in Gertie's family's life. Her husband drowned while swimming during summer vacation in 1950. Sydney's brother, Morris, died in a plane crash in the Gulf. Plane and body of him and his wife were never found. So death, for all their privilege, death kind of stalked the family in some respects.
One last question then.
Sure.
Did her two daughters take after her? What were their lives like? Were they also adventurers?
Well, so Gertie's daughters, to be frank, despised her. Her eldest daughter is still alive, lives in Connecticut, did not want to talk to me, said she had nothing good to say about her mother. So the wounds of separation lasted decades long. Her other daughter, and that eldest daughter, refused to attend the funeral. The other daughter, Beau, had a similarly complicated relationship with her mother, kind of love-hate thing. I think they never really forgave her for what they saw as her abandonment of them. And this wasn't simply during the war. Gertie's view of children was that they were best seen occasionally, holidays, maybe some weekends, but better off that they're in boarding school with governesses. So she didn't see her children a whole lot. There's a famous passage in her daughter's memoir where the daughter asks her, did you not like us? And Gertie said to her, you say I'm a bad mother, but how could I be a bad mother? I was never there. So there is, these are the issues that complicate people's reactions to Gertie. But they're also, for me, some of the things that make her so compelling and interesting. And I hope if and when you read the book, you'll come away with a sense of this very multi-dimensional woman.
I saw in the brochure to advertise your speech that there was a movie made of her life. Was it accurate compared to your book?
It actually wasn't a movie made of her life. It was, so one of her friends was Philip Barry, who was a playwright in the 1920s and 30s in New York. And he wrote a play called Holiday that was based in part on this very wealthy family. And the main character in the play was based on Gertie and his knowledge of Gertie. And it was about this, adventurous young woman who was bristling at the confines of her family's wealth and expectations. It was eventually turned into a movie, and Katharine Hepburn played the Gertie character in the movie Holiday, which I think you can probably get on Amazon or Netflix or wherever. Well worth watching. It's a period piece. But yes, that's the only movie I know of.
When Gertie was taken, did her family use any of their influence or fortune to try and get her out?
Well, no. They were kind of dependent on the U.S. authorities. They did write to her through the International Committee of the Red Cross. You could write to any prisoner of war. Unfortunately, none of the letters got through, and only one letter from Gertie got out, and that was a letter that she wrote to a friend called Marion Hall. It was a really interesting letter. She kind of slipped in little pieces of information for because she knew Marion Hall would give it to the authorities, just to let them know what she had said about herself. And in classic Gertie fashion, her sign-off at the end of the letter was, "Your caged lion, Gertie."